Happy birthday, honey. Robert called from the kitchen, his voice warm over the smell of fresh coffee, just as my finger pressed the enter key. 58 today, 30 years of skipped European vacations. The Vanguard portal took a fraction of a second to load. Available balance, $0. I blinked. The cursor blinked back at me against the stark white background. I closed my eyes, took a measured breath, and opened them again. $0. The zero sat there perfectly round, devoid of value. Emotion, a null variable. Vanguard updated their interface last week. Perhaps this was a caching error. I slid the mouse across my home office desk, clicking the refresh icon. The little circle spun, freezing before snapping back. Available balance, $0. Elena, Robert's voice drifted down the hallway. Are you coming out? The joint retirement account, the one we fed consistently since our first anniversary, was empty, drained, a complete withdrawal. Emotion. The air suddenly became thin. I took a breath, but my lungs refused to expand. The mahogany desk tilted by a fraction of a degree. I opened a new tab, typing in the URL for our primary checking account.
Password. Enter. Two-factor authentication code sent to my phone. My thumb slipped on the glass screen. My hands were sweating.
The checking account loaded, normal balance, but the savings account linked below it showed exactly $50. I leaned back in my leather chair. My mind, trained for decades to balance the equation, went to work. Bank error, a massive routing error. That was the only logical explanation. Emotion. I scrolled down to the transaction history. The page loaded slowly, as if struggling under the data. Wire transfer, Nussel outgoing ref 773902A, $1,245,600. The destination was a routing number I didn't recognize. The numbers burned into my retinas. Emotion de those as appreans. Emotions the trans the bad $1,245,600. $1,245,600. The safety net for our old age. A cold, physical ache dropped into the pit of my stomach, pulling downward like a sudden increase in gravity. The familiar weight of my reading glasses felt unbearable. My pulse quickened, a subtle drumbeat accelerating until it registered as a bruising against my ribs. I tapped a pen against the desk. 1, 2, emotion. 3, a grounding mechanism. The scale of the loss defied immediate comprehension. Elena? Robert appeared in the doorway. Emotion. He wore tailored gray slacks and a crisp white shirt. He held 2 steaming mugs of coffee. His smile was wide, an easy expression he wore for as long as I had known him. It was a face built on trust, or at least the illusion of it. Is everything all right? He asked. He didn't look at the monitor. His gaze remained fixed on my face. The Vanguard account, I said, my voice entirely flat. Tense my eyes on the transaction reference. If I looked at him, the dam holding back the panic might break, releasing a flood of fear into the office. What about it? He set a mug down on my desk. It's empty, Robert. He paused. I watched his reflection in the dark bezel of the monitor. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. He shoved his hands into his pockets. Oh, that, he said. His voice took on a soothing tone. Don't worry about it, honey. I initiated a transfer on Thursday. I turned my chair to face him. His right hand came out of his pocket, adjusting the fabric of his shirt. His movements were jerky. It was as though a wire had snapped inside his carefully calibrated exterior. A transfer? I asked, my tone perfectly level. Over $1 million. Without discussing it with me? It's an investment reallocation, he said quickly. He met my eyes. A temporary move. There's this commercial real estate fund. Very exclusive. High yield, fast turnaround. I had to move quickly to secure our position. A birthday surprise. I looked at him, the picture of suburban success, but his eyes darted toward the window for a microsecond before snapping back. He swallowed. The scent of hazelnut coffee suddenly made my throat burn. Emotion. It smelled hollow, synthetic. An investment reallocation, I repeated, corporate jargon designed to obfuscate. As an accountant, I despised vague terminology. Emotioned, it was the language of liars, the camouflage of a profound betrayal. Exactly, he said, offering that disarming smile again. He placed a hand on my shoulder. His palm was damp. It's perfectly safe. The paperwork is just processing. You know how these funds are. He squeezed my shoulder, then picked up his coffee. Now come on, your breakfast is getting cold. He walked out of the office, footsteps light on the hardwood floor. I didn't follow him immediately. I turned back to the screen. The zero remained. Emotion. The routing number belonged to an offshore holding bank. The numbers didn't lie. They didn't offer disarming smiles. A bank error was impossible. A temporary reallocation was highly improbable. Emotion the wolfscons. Maybe there was another explanation, but my training demanded evidence. I tapped my pen against the desk. 1, 2, emotion. 3, the foundation of our financial security had just been liquidated, and my husband had just lied to my face. The panic crystallized into a sharp focus. I didn't know the exact variables yet, but I knew the ledger was completely unbalanced, and I was going to tear the entire equation apart to find the missing numbers. The scent of hazelnut coffee hung heavy in the hallway, cloying and sweet, as I followed the sound of Robert whistling in the kitchen. I pushed my chair back, the leather creaking sharply, and stood up on legs that moved like they belonged to someone else. The ringing in my ears persisted, a high-pitched buzz that drowned out the hum of the refrigerator. I walked into the kitchen. The morning light poured through the large bay windows, casting a dark shadow across the pristine granite countertops. I glanced at the stainless steel appliances. It was a space designed for comfort and domestic bliss. Today, the entire room felt entirely hollow, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. Robert stood by the island, pouring a second cup of coffee. I watched him. He wore his tailored gray slacks and a crisp white shirt. The fabric looked smooth, devoid of any rough texture. He turned, offering that familiar, disarming smile. It was a smile built on trust, a smile that had reassured me through 30 years of marriage. "There you are," he said, pushing a plate of eggs and toast toward the empty stool. The ceramic plate made a loud clatter. "Eat up, we have a lot to celebrate today." I didn't sit. I pressed my hands flat against the cold granite, tightening my grip on the edge. The stone grounded me. The panic was still there, a physical ache in my chest, a heavy weight pulling down on my ribs. But the shock was beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, analytical focus. "I want to talk about the Vanguard account," I said, my voice steady. Robert sighed, a soft, exaggerated sound of mock exasperation. He took a sip of his coffee. The aroma of hazelnut was suddenly overwhelming. "Elena, honey, I told you, it's an investment reallocation, a temporary move. A temporary move of $1.2 million, I replied. "You transferred our entire retirement savings to an offshore holding bank. That is not a standard domestic real estate fund." His hand, holding the ceramic mug, paused halfway to the counter. The movement was barely perceptible, a micro-hesitation.
Pin set the mug down carefully. "Offshore? Where did you get that idea?" "It's a specialized commercial fund based out of Delaware. The holding company might have international ties, but the assets are domestic." "The routing number belongs to a bank in the Cayman Islands, Robert," I stated, staring at his face. "I know the format." He chuckled, a low, smooth sound. He picked up a napkin and wiped his mouth. "You're always so meticulous, Elle. You see a series of numbers and your mind jumps to the worst possible conclusion. The fund manager operates out of Delaware, but they use international clearinghouses for tax efficiency. It's perfectly legal and highly profitable. I have the prospectus in my briefcase. Show it to me. I will, he said smoothly. Tonight, after dinner. Like I said, it was supposed to be a surprise. I studied him. He didn't look away. His gaze was steady, his expression earnest. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the island. The bright sunlight illuminated the fine lines around his eyes. Look, he continued, his tone shifting to one of gentle reassurance. I know it's a shock to see a zero balance. I should have warned you. That's my fault. But the market is shifting. Our conservative portfolio was losing against inflation. I had to take action. The guys at the club, Harrison and Vance, they're in on this too. It's a guaranteed 20% return in 6 months. A guaranteed 20% return in 6 months. The phrase echoed in my mind, a sour note in the quiet room. In the world of finance, guaranteed and 20% did not belong in the same sentence. It was the language of Ponzi schemes and frauds. Emotion.
I want the name of the fund manager, I said. Elena, please, he said, his smile faltering slightly. You're interrogating me on your birthday. The name, Robert. He straightened up, his posture stiffening. The affable facade cracked, revealing a flash of irritation. It's Apex Capital Management. Happy now? Apex Capital Management, I repeated. I turned away from the island and walked toward the hallway. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my focus, but the confusion was gone. I no longer wanted to believe him. The sheer volume of vague terminology, the defensive posture, the lack of immediate documentation, it all pointed to a massive deception. Where are you going? He called after me, his voice carrying a sudden, sharp edge. To check the prospectus, I said without looking back. I'll expect it on the desk by noon. I walked back into my home office and shut the door. The familiar weight of the betrayal settled over me, a suffocating blanket. I sat at my desk and pulled my laptop closer. Apex Capital Management. I typed the name into the search engine. The results loaded instantly. Nothing, no website, no SEC filings, no news articles, a complete void. The ledger was unbalanced, the money was gone, and my husband was at the center of it all. I picked up my pen and began to write. 1, 2, 3. I was going to find every hidden variable, and I was going to tear his carefully constructed lies apart. Emotion. Maybe it was just a terrible investment. Perhaps Apex Capital was real, a desperate gamble by a man afraid of getting old. I held on to that fragile hope, a thin shield against the growing panic. The front door clicked shut. I'll be at the club until 3. Robert had called out from the foyer, his voice cheerful, entirely devoid of the tension that was currently crushing my chest. I listened to the sound of his car engine rumble to life, the tires crunching over the gravel driveway, fading into the ambient silence of the suburban morning. I stood in the hallway for 5 full minutes. The silence in the house was absolute, thick and oppressive. I turned and walked toward his home office. The oak door swung open with a faint creak. The room carried the lingering scent of expensive cologne and the harsh odor of stale cigar smoke. It was a masculine sanctuary, meticulously curated. I walked to the mahogany desk and pressed my hands flat against the polished surface. The wood was cold, smooth, completely unforgiving. I needed the prospectus. I needed the paper trail. I pulled the top drawer. It slid open with a metallic clatter, revealing neatly organized pens, paper clips, and a stack of blank stationery. Nothing out of the ordinary. I moved to the second drawer. Client files, old tax returns, warranties for appliances we no longer owned, the mundane debris of a shared life. I closed it. The bottom drawer on the right side was locked. I glanced at the brass keyhole. Robert never locked his drawers. We had no secrets, or so I had believed. Something about the locked drawer mocked me, a dark void in the center of our marriage. I dropped to my knees, the carpet rough against my skin. I reached under the desk, my fingers tracing the underside of the heavy wood. I knew Robert's habits. He was a creature of convenience, averse to actual effort. My fingers brushed against a strip of tape. I peeled it back, feeling the sharp, cold edge of a small brass key. I tightened my grip on the key, the jagged teeth pressing painfully into my palm. I inserted it into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, heavy click. I pulled the drawer open. There were no financial documents. No prospectus from Apex Capital Management, no offshore routing numbers. Instead, resting in the center of the empty space was a sleek black smartphone. Beside it lay a rectangular plastic card, the kind used for electronic locks. It was a dark navy blue with a bright silver logo embossed on the corner. Asterisk the Belvedere asterisk, a luxury high-rise in the downtown district. I reached out and picked up the phone. The plastic was smooth, unnaturally cold. It was a prepaid model, cheap and untraceable. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated instantly, throwing a harsh, bright light across my face, casting a long shadow on the wall behind me. The lock screen displayed no wallpaper, just a digital clock and a single notification. A text message received 20 minutes ago. Asterisk, miss you already. See you at the condo at 1 o'clock. Asterisk. The sender was simply listed as C. The air in the room suddenly evaporated. The physical ache in my chest expanded, blooming into a suffocating hollow weight. It was as though the floorboards had simply vanished beneath me, leaving me in a terrifying free fall. A bad investment was a failure of judgment. Emotion.
Tense of bad investment was a mathematical problem that could be solved with spreadsheets, lawyers, and time. This was not an investment. The money, the $1.2 million, the skipped vacations, the 80-hour work weeks, it hadn't gone to Delaware or the Cayman Islands to build a nest egg. It had gone downtown. It had gone to a luxury condo. It had gone to sea. A profound sense of devastation washed over me, a dark, heavy tide that drowned out the hum of the air conditioning. The grief was so sudden, so absolute, that I couldn't even draw a full breath. The man who had poured my coffee an hour ago, the man who had smiled and called me honey on my 58th birthday, was a complete stranger. Our entire life was a carefully constructed facade, a lie built on 30 years of misplaced trust. My hands began to shake. I stared at the bright white letters of the text message. The betrayal was absolute, leaving a bitter, sour taste flooding the back of my throat. It wasn't just greed, it was abandonment. It was a calculated, deliberate erasure of my existence. I looked at the magnetic keycard. I traced the embossed logo with my thumb. The texture was raised, definitive. The tears did not come. The despair was too deep, too cold for crying. Instead, the panic began to harden, compressing under the immense pressure of the betrayal into something sharp and dangerous. I was an accountant. I understood how to track assets, how to identify liabilities, and how to balance an equation. Robert thought he could simply zero out my account and walk away to his new life. He was wrong. I slipped the burner phone and the keycard into the pocket of my slacks. The plastic felt like a physical burden, a heavy anchor dragging me down into an unknown abyss. But I wasn't going to drown. Emotion?
I was going to find out exactly who C was. I was going to find the condo, and I was going to audit every single second of Robert's lies. The ledger was open, and I was going to collect the debt. Oh, Elena, you're overthinking this, Martha cooed, her hand reaching across the polished mahogany table to squeeze my arm. The gesture was meant to be comforting, a display of maternal warmth that had defined our friendship for 4 decades. I stared at the delicate porcelain teacup in front of me. The liquid inside was a dark amber color. I picked it up, letting the warm ceramic press against my cold, damp palms. I took a sip. The bitter taste of the Earl Grey tea did nothing to wash away the dry, suffocating panic that had coated my throat since the morning. Overthinking? I echoed, my voice tight. The sound of my own voice seemed foreign, brittle. Martha, the account is empty. $1.2 million. And he has a key card to a downtown condo. A condo he visits with someone named C. Martha sighed, a soft, soothing sound that vibrated in the quiet sunroom. The room smelled of fresh lavender and expensive furniture polish. It was a sterile, perfect environment. Men go through phases, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She leaned closer, her expensive silk blouse rustling. You know how Robert is. He loves the thrill of a new venture. Apex Capital. It sounds exactly like the kind of flashy, high-risk fund he would boast about at the country club. Apex Capital doesn't exist, I replied, tightening my grip on the teacup until my knuckles turned bright white. I ran a full audit search. It's a phantom entity. Maybe it's a shell company for tax purposes, Martha suggested smoothly. She picked up a silver spoon and stirred her tea, the metal clinking rhythmically against the porcelain. You accountants always look at the worst-case scenario. Emotion?
You balance the books, but you forget the human element. I looked at her. Martha's face was arranged in an expression of deep sympathy. The corners of her mouth were turned down, her brow furrowed in concern. But as the bright afternoon sunlight illuminated her features, I noticed her eyes. They were a pale, icy blue, and they remained entirely cold, devoid of the warmth her voice projected. It was a fleeting observation, quickly dismissed under the crushing weight of my own grief. "And the condo?" I asked, the desperation leaking into my tone. I hated the sound of it. It was the sound of a woman begging for a lie. The prepaid phone? The message? Martha reached out again, her manicured fingers resting lightly on my forearm. Her touch felt unnaturally light, almost performative. A surprise party? A retirement gift? Or perhaps he's helping a colleague. You know how he is, always playing the savior. I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted to lean into the comforting fiction she was weaving. A bad investment, a misguided surprise. Anything was better than the gaping, dark void of absolute betrayal. The hope was fragile, but it offered a temporary shelter from the devastating reality. I should confront him tonight, I said, setting the teacup down with a sharp clatter. I need to demand the truth. Martha's fingers tightened slightly on my arm. No, she said quickly. The sudden sharpness in her tone contrasted with the soothing hum of the air conditioning. Don't do anything rash, Elena. She withdrew her hand and picked up a sweet scone from the tiered tray, taking a small, precise bite. A mosid. Awana.
If you confront him now, without the full picture, you'll just push him into a defensive posture. If it is an affair, he'll simply hide his tracks better. If it's a legitimate investment, you'll look paranoid and ruin your birthday dinner. The logic was sound. It was the kind of calculated risk assessment I would normally appreciate, but something about her insistence felt slightly off. It was as if she was managing my reaction, carefully steering me away from the ledger. So what do? I asked, the hollow ache in my chest pulsating with every heartbeat. The burden of the secret was already exhausting. You wait, Martha said, offering a warm, reassuring smile that didn't quite reach those cold blue eyes. You act normal. Let him think you bought the investment reallocation story. Give it a few days. Observe, gather your data quietly like the meticulous woman you are. I stared at the geometric patterns on the floral rug. The fear of destroying my 30-year marriage held me paralyzed. A part of me, the weak, vulnerable part that terrified me, clung to the denial. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe the equation could still be balanced without tearing my life apart. Okay, I whispered, the word tasting like ash. I'll wait. Martha smiled again, picking up her teacup. Good. Now let's talk about something else. You look pale. Let me pour you another cup. I nodded, accepting the warm cup, allowing the illusion of support to temporarily mask the profound loss. I would wait, but the ledger remained unbalanced and the numbers were slowly beginning to align. Hij were zijn alimentos. I and then if makes a mine al diwrd sons. And then as yours would go waxel, and then will get a line. I gripped the plastic keycard so tightly my fingernails bit into my palm, stepping into the stainless steel elevator of the Belvedere. The metal doors slid shut with a solid, definitive clatter, isolating me in a box of polished mirrors and bright LED lights. I stared at my own reflection. I looked exactly as I always did, a 58-year-old accountant in a sensible beige trench coat. But beneath the surface, the hollow ache in my chest was pulsating, a steady rhythm of fear and profound betrayal. The elevator climbed with a barely perceptible hum. I watched the digital numbers tick upward, 10, 11, 12. I was bracing myself for the heartbreak. I expected to find a lavishly decorated love nest. I anticipated the scent of expensive and familiar perfume lingering in the air, the sight of a carelessly discarded silk robe, the undeniable proof of C, asterisk 14th floor. The doors parted with a soft chime. The hallway was a long, sterile corridor of gray carpet and recessed lighting. The silence was absolute, pressing against my eardrums like a physical weight. I walked slowly, the rubber soles of my loafers making no sound. Unit 1408. I paused before the heavy, dark wood door. I pulled the keycard from my pocket. It felt smooth, unnaturally cold against my skin. I pressed it against the electronic lock. A green light flashed, accompanied by a sharp click. I pushed the door open, my breath catching in my throat. I braced for the overwhelming tide of grief. I stepped inside. The immediate sensation was not the aroma of a romantic liaison, but the harsh chemical odor of industrial carpet cleaner and the sharp tang of ozone. I blinked, adjusting to the sudden glare. Emotion. The overhead fluorescent lights were blindingly bright, casting sharp, unyielding shadows across the floor. There was no velvet sofa. There were no scattered clothes or framed photographs. The condo had been stripped of all residential comfort. The living area was dominated by two large industrial-grade paper shredders. Against the far wall, where a television should have been, sat a bank of 4 computer monitors, their screens glowing a stark, clinical blue. Next to them was a massive filing cabinet, its steel surface gleaming in the artificial light. I walked further into the room, my hand trailing along the edge of a cheap folding table that served as a makeshift desk. The texture was rough, utilitarian plastic. I stood in the center of the room, turning slowly. The despair that had been suffocating me began to recede, replaced by a sudden, sharp jolt of confusion. This wasn't an apartment for a mistress. This was a war room. It was a sterile corporate front. I walked toward the monitors. The screensaver bounced a simple geometric logo across the dark background. I touched the mouse, waking the primary screen. A password prompt appeared, completely locking me out. I turned my attention to the folding table. There were stacks of manila envelopes neatly aligned. I picked one up. It was heavy, sealed with thick tape. A shipping label was attached, addressed to a P.O. box in Zurich. Maybe the mistress narrative was entirely wrong. Perhaps Robert wasn't funding a second family. Something about the sheer volume of shredded paper in the translucent bins suggested a much darker equation. A man having an affair buys jewelry and flowers. He doesn't rent a 14th floor luxury condo to set up industrial shredders and international shipping stations. I opened a drawer in the filing cabinet. It squeaked in protest. Inside were rows of perfectly organized ledgers, labeled not with names but with alphanumeric codes. I pulled one out and flipped it open. My eyes scanned the columns. The numbers were massive. Transfers of capital, routing numbers, offshore holding designations. It was the language of finance, but structured in a way designed to conceal rather than illuminate. It looked like a large-scale money laundering operation or an elaborate shell company network. The realization hit me, cold and clear. The $1.2 million missing from our Vanguard account wasn't just gone, it was the seed money for whatever massive liability this room represented. The betrayal I had felt earlier was a personal, intimate wound, but this was a systemic, calculated crime. The fear morphed into a deep, consuming curiosity. As an accountant, I had spent 30 years balancing books, ensuring every variable accounted for every dollar. The men Robert played golf with, Harrison and Vance, they had been mentioned this morning. Were they part of this? The grief was still there, a dull ache at the back of my mind, but it was overshadowed by the sheer magnitude of the puzzle in front of me. I understood ledgers. I understood the flow of capital. I took my smartphone from my pocket and began photographing every open page, every shipping label, every monitor screen. The camera shutter clicked repeatedly, an aggressive rhythm breaking the silence. The loss of my marriage felt like a terrifying freefall, as if the ground had been ripped from beneath me. But standing in this cold, sterile room, I finally found a foothold. Robert thought he could hide his transactions behind a veneer of suburban normalcy, but he had made a critical error. He had stolen from an auditor, and I was going to follow the money. Emosen, you mustn't wallung. Put the phone down, Mrs. Vance. The voice came from the doorway. It was crisp, even, and completely devoid of the panic I expected. I froze, the camera shutter clicking one final time, the sound unnaturally loud in the sterile condo. I turned slowly, bracing myself for the homewrecker. I expected a woman draped in expensive apologies, perhaps radiating the defensive arrogance of someone who had stolen 30 years of my life. The woman standing by the door was perhaps 30 years old. She wore a tailored charcoal gray pantsuit, a crisp white blouse, and black stiletto heels. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, immaculate bun. The air shifted around her, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of winter and a faint trace of peppermint, entirely different from the heavy, sweet perfumes Martha favored. You must be C, I said. My voice betrayed a slight tremor, a weakness I instantly despised. The bitter taste of adrenaline flooded the back of my throat. She didn't react to the accusation. She didn't flinch. She simply walked into the room, her heels striking the beige carpet with calculated precision. She didn't approach me. Instead, she moved toward the folding table nearest the door, deliberately positioning herself close to the exit. She placed her smooth leather briefcase on the plastic surface. "My name is Chloe," she said, her expression entirely neutral. Her pale green eyes locked onto mine. She rarely blinked, her gaze holding a steady, unyielding pressure. I gripped my smartphone tightly, the cold metal edges digging into my palm. "Are you looking for Robert? Because he's at the club, or so he claims." Chloe unclasped her briefcase with a sharp, metallic snap. "I am not looking for Robert, Mrs. Vance. I am here to verify the daily transit logs. You are disrupting a highly sensitive environment." "A sensitive environment?" I repeated, gesturing toward the industrial shredders and the glowing blue monitors. The hollow ache of marital betrayal was rapidly transforming into a sharp, terrifying suspicion. "Is that what you call this? A love nest disguised as a corporate front?" Chloe paused. She looked at me, a microscopic tightening of her jaw the only visible reaction. She tilted her head slightly, the fluorescent light catching the sharp angle of her cheekbone. "A love nest," she repeated, her tone flattening out, stripping away any pretense of warmth. She let out a short, hollow sound that might have been a laugh, though her eyes remained entirely cold. "Mrs. Vance, I do not sleep with your husband. Robert is a liability. He is clumsy, he is arrogant, and he talks too much at his country club." I stared at her. The words hung in the aggressively chilled air. The foundation of my grief, the agonizing assumption of an affair, began to crack under the weight of her absolute pragmatism. Then what is this? I demanded, pointing a trembling finger at the ledgers inside the open steel cabinet. What is Apex Capital Management? Chloe rested her hands flat on the folding table. Her fingernails were trimmed short, devoid of polish. Apex Capital is a routing hub. It is a necessary fiction. We manage the accounts. We ensure capital flows from high-risk domestic sources into secure, untraceable offshore entities. Your husband is merely a regional facilitator, a middleman. The pieces of the equation slam together with terrifying clarity. Emotion. It wasn't infidelity, it was a massive financial fraud. It was a money laundering operation, and Robert was deeply embedded in it. He transferred our retirement fund, I stated, the words dropping like stones into a bottomless well. $1.2 million. For the first time, Chloe blinked. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thin gray tablet. Her fingers danced across the smooth glass screen. Ah, she said softly, the Vanguard reallocation. Yes, that was flagged this morning. Robert was specifically instructed not to mix personal assets with the operational liquidity pool. It draws unwanted attention. He stole it, I said, the despair finally hardening into cold, absolute rage. The burden of 30 years of careful budgeting, the skipped vacations, the relentless discipline, all of it erased to fund a criminal enterprise. He invested it, Chloe corrected, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. And in doing so, he tied your personal survival directly to the success of this hub. If you expose this operation, Mrs. Vance, you do not just send your husband to federal prison, you destroy your own capital. The money is gone. The only way you get it back is if the ledger balances at the end of the quarter. I looked at the bank of glowing monitors, the stacks of manila envelopes addressed to Zurich, and the emotionless woman standing near the exit. My accountant mind, trained to identify liabilities and audit discrepancies, began processing the sheer scale of the deception. The betrayal was no longer just about a broken marriage, it was about survival. I want to see the master ledger, I said, my voice steadying, matching the cold temperature of the room. Chloe's hands stopped moving. She stared at me, the silence stretching between us, heavy and unresolved. Emotion. I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk, my knuckles turning bright white as the final alphanumeric sequence fell into place. The glow of my laptop screen burned against the absolute darkness of the home office, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. Outside, the suburban night was entirely still, a deceptive calm that contrasted violently with the storm raging inside my chest. I had spent the last 5 hours cross-referencing the photographs I took at the condo with public banking registries. My eyes were dry and burning, fixed in an unblinking stare at the spreadsheet I had built. Initially, I thought Robert was simply a fool engaged in elaborate tax evasion or simple embezzlement. That was the kind of white-collar crime that arrogant men at country clubs rationalized over scotch. But as I decoded the routing sequences Chloe had left on her screen, the narrative shifted, growing darker with every keystroke. The capital wasn't just being hidden, it was being washed. The alphanumeric codes corresponded to a series of shell companies notorious for laundering funds for the Sinaloa cartel. I picked up my coffee mug. The liquid inside was cold, carrying the bitter taste of stale grounds. I forced myself to take a sip, letting the sour fluid coat my dry throat. The room smelled of old paper and the metallic tang of an overworked laptop fan. I set the mug down, the ceramic clattering loudly against the wood. A bad investment could bankrupt a family, but laundering cartel money, that was a death sentence. The betrayal I felt this morning, the grief of a wife discovering a missing retirement fund, was entirely eclipsed by a sudden, towering wave of absolute anger. It was as though a match had been dropped into a pool of gasoline. The hollow ache in my chest was incinerated, replaced by a white-hot fury. Robert hadn't just stolen my money. Emotion. He had placed a loaded gun against my head, all to secure a guaranteed 20% return. I pushed away from the desk, my leather chair squeaking sharply in the quiet room. I began to pace. The plush texture of the carpet felt suffocating beneath my bare feet. My breathing was ragged, a harsh, rhythmic sound that echoed in the silence. I walked over to the large bay window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtain. Outside, the suburban street was bathed in the soft, yellow light of the street lamps. The Henderson family's sprinkler system hummed quietly across the street, spraying water over their perfectly manicured lawn. The Harrisons' golden retriever barked twice in the distance. It was the epitome of safe, predictable domesticity. And yet, sitting right here in the middle of it all, my husband had constructed a financial bridge directly to the most dangerous men on the continent. The absolute absurdity of it amplified my rage, twisting it into something sharp and unforgiving. How could he be so stupid? How could the man I had trusted for 30 years, the man who meticulously polished his golf clubs every Sunday, involve himself in a global criminal enterprise? I remembered his smug smile this morning in the kitchen, the casual way he poured his hazelnut coffee, and dismissed the missing $1.2 million. The memory was no longer confusing, it was infuriating. The sheer arrogance of his deception was a physical burden, a heavy weight pressing down on my shoulders. He thought he was untouchable. He thought his pristine suburban life would shield him from the monsters he was doing business with. But I understood the numbers. I understood the flow of capital better than he ever would. The ledgers at the Belvedere were massive. The volume of money moving through that 14th floor room was staggering. If a single transaction failed, if the ledger did not balance at the end of the quarter, the people behind those routing numbers would not file a lawsuit. They would simply eliminate the liability. And as his wife, I was a liability. The fear was still there, a cold, damp presence lingering at the edges of my mind, but the anger was the dominant force. It focused my vision. It sharpened my accountant's instincts into a weapon. I walked back to the desk and stared at the screen. The numbers glared back at me, a digital map of Robert's greed and my own misplaced trust. Maybe he thought I would just cry and file for divorce. Perhaps he assumed I was too fragile to dig deeper. Something about his condescension, the way he called me honey while robbing me blind, fueled a relentless, dangerous energy inside me. I wasn't going to be a victim. I wasn't going to sit in my suburban house waiting for a cartel enforcer to knock on my door because my husband couldn't balance his illicit books. I sat back down, the leather cool against my skin. The despair was gone, burned away by the fury. I placed my hands on the keyboard. The plastic keys yielded smoothly under my fingertips. I began writing a new script, a program designed to continuously scrape the routing data I had uncovered. If Robert's survival depended on balancing the ledger, then I was going to ensure that the ledger belonged to me. The anger was a cold, bright light, illuminating every dark corner of his lies. I was going to dismantle his operation from the inside, and I was going to use his own numbers to do it. The candlelight flickered across the pristine bone china, throwing long, erratic shadows across the faces of the two people I trusted most. The dining room was an immaculate stage. I had spent the late afternoon preparing the rosemary roasted lamb, ensuring the table settings were perfectly aligned. The rich, savory aroma of the meat hung heavily in the air, but the only thing I could taste was the metallic, bitter residue of adrenaline. I tightened my grip on the silver steak knife, pressing my thumb against the smooth metal handle. It grounded me. I had to maintain the facade. I was an accountant. I knew how to hide discrepancies until the final audit. A toast to 58 wonderful years, honey, Robert declared. He stood at the head of the table, raising his crystal wine glass. His posture was relaxed, his smile perfectly engineered. The crystal caught the candlelight, throwing a bright, prismatic reflection against the dark wallpaper. To Elena, Martha echoed, raising her own glass. She sat to my right, wearing a maroon silk dress that rustled softly as she moved. She reached out and patted my forearm, her touch unnaturally light. "You look absolutely radiant tonight, darling." I forced my facial muscles into a wide, appreciative smile. Thank you both. I couldn't ask for a better evening. I lifted my glass and took a sip. The Cabernet was sour, almost acidic on my tongue. I set the glass down with a soft clatter. Robert took his seat, immediately reaching into his jacket pocket to pull out his smartphone. He placed it face up on the tablecloth next to his plate. The screen remained dark, but his eyes darted toward it every few seconds. "Are we expecting a call, Robert?" Martha asked, her tone dripping with exaggerated maternal sympathy. She cut a small piece of lamb, her movements precise and delicate. Robert chuckled, a low, smooth sound that vibrated in the quiet room. His right hand drifted upward, his fingers adjusting the knot of his silk tie. "Just a late email from the office. Don't worry about it, honey. The market is volatile, and the new reallocation strategy requires constant monitoring." He touched his tie again. It was a microscopic movement, a physical tell I had cataloged over 30 years of marriage. He only did that when he was actively deceiving me. The reallocation strategy, the cartel routing hub, the lie was so enormous, so inherently dangerous, that his casual dismissal felt like a physical blow. I looked down at my plate, slicing the lamb into perfectly even squares. "The Delaware fund you mentioned this morning?" "Exactly," Robert said quickly. His phone vibrated softly against the wood table. He glanced at the glowing screen, his jaw tightening for a fraction of a second before he flipped the device face down. "Just routine logistics. It's highly technical, Elena. Not worth spoiling your birthday dinner over." I pushed the meat around my plate, unable to swallow. The sheer arrogance of his performance was a heavy burden, pressing down on my chest. He was sitting in our suburban dining room, drinking expensive wine, while the people at the Belvedere were washing blood money. "I think it's wonderful that Robert is taking such an active role in securing your future," Martha chimed in. She reached across the corner of the table, her manicured fingers resting lightly on Robert's wrist. "You know how conservative Elena is with numbers, Robert. She balances the books, but sometimes you need someone with vision to take the leap." Robert offered her a warm, appreciative nod. "Exactly, Martha, thank you. Someone has to look at the big picture." I stopped slicing. The room went dead silent. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed to vanish entirely. I looked at Martha. Her face was arranged in a mask of supportive, sympathetic warmth. Her mouth was curved into a gentle smile, but her eyes, illuminated by the flickering candles, were completely cold. They were pale, icy blue, and they remained entirely devoid of any genuine affection. And then it happened. It was a micro-interaction, an exchange so brief that the old Elena, the naive, trusting accountant who believed in the safety of suburban life, would have missed it entirely. Robert lifted his wine glass. As the rim touched his lips, his eyes flicked toward Martha. Emotion. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a sharp, interrogative look. Martha did not turn her head. She kept her gaze fixed on me, maintaining that terrible frozen smile, but her right index finger tapped exactly twice against the base of her wine glass. Robert's shoulders immediately dropped a fraction of an inch. The tension bled out of his posture. He relaxed, taking a long, slow sip of wine. He had asked a question silently, and she had answered it. The realization slammed into me with the force of a physical collision. The air was sucked out of the room. A profound, suffocating sense of despair flooded my veins, followed instantly by a terrifying clarity. Martha's advice this morning, don't do anything rash. Wait, give it a few days. She wasn't managing my emotional reaction as a concerned friend. She was managing a liability. She was securing the perimeter. The woman who had held my hand at my mother's funeral, the woman who had helped me pick out my wedding dress 30 years ago, was not a bystander. She was part of the cartel's equation. The betrayal was no longer just a missing retirement fund. It was an absolute erasure of my entire reality. I was surrounded. The two people I loved most in the world were actively coordinating my deception, sharing coded signals over the dinner I had cooked for them. I picked up my wine glass. The crystal was cold against my damp palm. My hands did not shake. The anger and the grief compressed into a dense, solid core of survival instinct. I smiled at Martha, matching her cold, unblinking gaze perfectly. "You're absolutely right, Martha," I said, my voice steady, smooth, and utterly hollow. "I just need to trust the process. The ledger always balances in the end."
The transit logs registered an unauthorized duplication sequence at 14:02 yesterday. The crisp, familiar voice was a sharp whisper directly in my right ear. The cheerful ambient pop music echoing through the grocery store speakers seemed to vanish entirely, replaced by a sudden deafening rushing sound in my head. I froze, my hand hovering over a display of bright, perfectly waxed gala apples. The cold metal of the shopping cart dug into my hip. I slowly turned my head. Chloe was standing less than a foot away. She had traded her sharp charcoal suit for a nondescript beige trench coat and a gray scarf, blending seamlessly into the mid-morning suburban grocery crowd. A woman pushing a cart full of toddlers rolled past us, completely oblivious to the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the hum of the open refrigerator units. Chloe didn't look at me. Her pale green eyes were fixed on a display of organic avocados. She picked one up, testing the firmness with her thumb. She positioned her body perfectly parallel to the main aisle, giving her a clear, unobstructed path to the automatic exit doors. "I am trying to keep you alive, Mrs. Vance," she said evenly. She set the avocado down and picked up another. She rarely blinked. The mechanical precision of her movements was terrifying. "You downloaded 72 gigabytes of proprietary financial data onto an external drive. You assumed Robert's system was unmonitored. It isn't. The moment you inserted the USB, you tripped a silent alarm in the primary ledger." I gripped the handle of my shopping cart. The plastic was smooth, offering no purchase for my damp palms. The illusion of secrecy, the empowering fantasy that I was a brilliant and visible auditor dismantling my husband's empire from the shadows, evaporated instantly. Emotion.
"They know?" I whispered, the words carrying the bitter taste of ash. "The automated security protocols flagged the anomaly," Chloe replied, her tone as sterile as a surgical instrument. "Robert was notified. He dismissed it as a glitch. He is a coward, and he prefers comfortable lies to dangerous truths. But the secondary oversight committee in Zurich does not believe in glitches." She finally turned her head and looked directly at me. The absolute lack of emotion in her gaze hit me like a physical blow. The terror I had managed to compartmentalize behind spreadsheets and data scraping burst forward, a heavy, suffocating weight that settled directly on my chest. "Who are they?" I asked. "You read the ledgers," she said smoothly. "You know exactly who they are. They are people who do not file lawsuits. If the quarterly audit tomorrow morning reveals a permanent data leak, they will not freeze Robert's accounts. They will simply eliminate the entire liability chain. That includes Robert, that includes Martha, and it includes you." I stared at the bright red skin of the apples, the vibrant colors blurring as my vision narrowed. The grocery store, with its brightly lit aisles and mundane domesticity, felt like a cage. I remembered the code I had written last night, the satisfying click of the keyboard as I siphoned the cartel's data into my own encrypted drive. I had thought I was balancing the equation. I had thought I was taking control. Instead, I had painted a target on my own back. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The fear was a cold, sharp knife scraping against my ribs. Emotion. "If you manage the accounts, why warn me?" Chloe adjusted her gray scarf, ensuring it covered the lower half of her neck. "Because a mess in the suburbs attracts federal attention. If you die violently in your home, the police ask questions. The FBI looks into Robert's accounts. My operation gets compromised. Your survival is currently a necessary variable for my continued efficiency." She leaned in slightly, the faint scent of peppermint and ozone cutting through the smell of fresh citrus. "You have until tomorrow morning, Mrs. Vance. If the data is not scrubbed from your personal servers, or if you attempt to contact law enforcement, the Oversight Committee will act. Erase the drive. Go home. Play the dutiful wife. Do not attempt to balance a ledger you do not have the capital to survive." She turned and walked away, her practical flat shoes making no sound against the polished linoleum. She moved with the fluid, uninterrupted grace of a predator, vanishing into the crowd near the bakery section. I stood completely still in the produce aisle, The ambient pop music swelled back into my awareness. The woman with the toddlers pushed her cart past me again. Everything was terrifyingly normal, but the reality of my existence had fundamentally shifted. The betrayal was no longer just a financial loss or a shattered marriage. It was a matter of physical survival. The fear was absolute, drowning out the logical, analytical part of my brain. I looked down at my hands gripping the cart. They were shaking violently. Robert had handed my life to a cartel. Martha was guarding the door, and the woman managing the accounts had just given me 24 hours to erase the only leverage I had. The equation was completely unbalanced, and I was running out of time. I shoved the heavy, leather-bound ledger into the bottom of my oversized tote bag, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped the brass key. The heavy brass door of the safety deposit vault swung open with a deep, resonating clunk, releasing a rush of aggressively chilled, sterile air. The small, windowless viewing room offered no escape, only four walls of polished steel reflecting my pale, exhausted face. 20 minutes ago, I was standing paralyzed in the produce aisle, listening to a cartel handler offer me 24 hours to erase my digital leverage, but standing still meant waiting for an executioner. If Robert's entire operation depended on the master ledger's balancing, then the digital copies I had stolen were only half the equation. The physical, offline backups, the paper trails linking the shell companies to the Zurich accounts, had to be secured. I knew Robert kept a private box at the First National branch downtown. I remembered finding the brass key in his golf bag 3 months ago, long before I suspected he was anything more than a cheating husband. I zipped the tote bag shut. The leather ledger was incredibly dense, a solid block of physical evidence anchoring the strap to my shoulder. The scent of old dry paper and the metallic tang of the vault mixed with the sour metallic taste of adrenaline coating the back of my throat. I pushed the viewing room door open and stepped out into the main vault corridor. The silence here was absolute, stretching out like a tightened drum, broken only by the squeak of my rubber-soled shoes against the pristine marble floor. I handed the master key back to the vault attendant, a young man who barely looked up from his tablet. "Have a good afternoon, Mrs. Vance," he muttered automatically. I didn't answer. I walked toward the heavy steel gates separating the vault from the main lobby. The transition from the silent, climate-controlled corridor to the bustling, echoing main floor was jarring. The afternoon sun streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, blindingly bright and deceptive in its warmth. I walked quickly, keeping my head down, adjusting the strap of my bag. I was 20 feet from the revolving glass doors when the main entrance swung open. Two men walked into the bank. They did not belong in the affluent, quiet suburb of Oak Creek. They were dressed in dark, poorly tailored suits that hung loosely over their broad shoulders. Tin's taller man wore aviator sunglasses despite the indoor lighting. The other man had a thick, jagged scar running along his jawline. They didn't walk to the teller line or the customer service desks. They stopped precisely 10 feet inside the lobby, their heads swiveling in perfect tactical synchronization as they scanned the room. My breath hitched, catching painfully in my chest. The ambient noise of the bank, the clicking of keyboards, the low murmur of customer complaints seemed to fade into static. The shorter man raised his right hand, pressing 2 fingers against a small, black earpiece tucked behind his ear. He nodded once, a sharp, violent motion. They were looking for someone, and based on Chloe's warning in the grocery store, I understood exactly who they were looking for. The paralyzing, suffocating fear that had gripped me in the produce aisle threatened to return. My knees felt weak, the marble floor suddenly unsteady beneath my feet. If I ran toward the revolving doors, I would have to pass directly between them. If I turned around and sprinted back toward the vault, the sudden movement would immediately draw their attention. I was trapped in a brightly lit public space, holding the only physical leverage that stood between me and a shallow grave. I took a sharp, shallow breath. The air smelled of stale coffee and expensive floor wax. Perhaps it was the last normal scent I would ever register. Maybe I should have listened to Chloe, but something about the sheer arrogance of Robert's deception fueled my focus. I gripped the strap of my tote bag tighter. The heavy weight of the ledger pressed against my hip. Robert had handed my life to these monsters because he was a coward. He played golf, he drank expensive wine, and he outsourced the violence the way a coward outsources his yard work. That was the kind of pathetic detachment that made me despise him. But I was an auditor. I spent my entire career calculating risk, identifying structural weaknesses, and balancing impossible equations. Emotion. Fear did not vanish, but it began to change shape. It compressed, hardening into a cold, dense core of absolute determination. It felt as if my spine was replaced by solid steel, giving me a dangerous, sharpened edge. I was no longer a passive victim waiting for the cartel to balance their books. I was an active combatant. I did not stop walking. I altered my trajectory slightly, moving toward a cluster of elderly women who were arguing with a loan officer near the side exit. I matched my pace to the slow, shuffling rhythm of the crowd. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the ground, projecting the image of an exhausted, invisible suburban housewife, moving as though I had nothing more dangerous than coupons in my bag. As I passed within 10 feet of the enforcers, the taller man turned his head. The dark lenses of his aviators swept across the crowd. For a single terrifying second, the reflection of the marble floor flashed in his glasses, directly in my line of sight. I didn't flinch. I didn't accelerate my pace. I simply adjusted my glasses, a practiced mundane movement, and continued walking behind the group of women. The heavy leather bag bumped reassuringly against my leg. I reached the side door, pushing the metal crash bar with my left hand. The heavy glass swung open, and the oppressive heat of the afternoon sun hit my face. I stepped out onto the concrete pavement, the roar of passing traffic instantly drowning out the silence of the bank. I walked rapidly toward my car, parked 2 blocks down the street. My hands were perfectly steady as I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. I threw the heavy tote bag onto the passenger seat, the leather ledger inside shifting with a satisfying, substantial thud. Robert thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought he could gamble my life away for a 20% return, but he had fundamentally miscalculated the variables. He had given me the keys to his destruction, and I fully intended to use them. I pushed the cold coffee mug aside, flattening the heavy yellowed paper of the ledger to align it with the digital spreadsheet glowing on my monitor. The dry, brittle pages of the physical book rustled loudly against the mahogany desk, filling the silent home office with a sound that resembled a closing trap. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the slatted blinds, casting stark geometric bars of light and shadow across the intricate columns of handwritten numbers. My heart rate had finally stabilized after the terrifying encounter at the bank. The panic of dodging the cartel enforcers had subsided, replaced entirely by an intense, singular focus. I dragged my silver pen down the final column of the physical ledger, my eyes darting between the faded black ink and the stark white cells of the digital screen. I was balancing the final equation. The digital data I had downloaded from the condo showed the rapid, chaotic movement of capital, millions of dollars scattered across dozens of shell companies. But the physical ledger I had recovered from the safety deposit box provided the missing variable, the origin and the final destination. The paper trail bypassed the noise, drawing a straight, undeniable line through the financial labyrinth. I followed the money. The $1.2 million Robert had stolen from our retirement fund was not isolated. It was bundled with 17 other identical transfers, creating a massive liquidity pool. That pool was routed through the Delaware holding company Robert had casually mentioned at dinner, before being wired to an offshore account in Zurich. But Zurich was not the end of the line. The physical ledger detailed a series of complex repatriation protocols. The funds were washed, sanitized, and funneled back into the domestic economy through a single, heavily shielded corporate entity, Silvercrest Equities. I tapped the keyboard, running a direct registry search for Silvercrest Equities through the state business database. The loading icon spun on the screen. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the laptop fan and the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The search results populated the screen. I leaned forward, my breath hitching slightly. I read the corporate officer listings. There was no board of directors. There were no anonymous offshore proxies. There was only a single registered proprietor, Martha Higgins, a Mosin. I stared at the name, the crisp black letters burning into my retina. It felt as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. I had spent the last 24 hours believing Robert was the architect of my destruction. I thought he was an arrogant, greedy man who had stumbled into a cartel operation and dragged me down with him. I thought Martha was simply a complicit handler, a sociopathic friend brought in to manage his erratic behavior. I was wrong. The corporate structure proved it. Robert was not the architect. Robert was just a middleman, an expendable pawn moving money at the local level. Martha wasn't managing him on behalf of the cartel. Martha asterisk was asterisk the cartel. She was the absolute top of the local pyramid, the sole proprietor of the laundering hub. The betrayal expanded, cracking open the foundation of my entire life. I remembered the way Martha had held my hand when my mother died. I remembered the countless afternoons we spent drinking tea in this very house, discussing the mundane details of our suburban lives. Perhaps she had been calculating my net worth the entire time. Maybe every smile, every sympathetic touch had been the practiced manipulation of a sociopath assessing a mark. The physical weight of the deception was staggering, heavy enough to crush a normal person. But I was not a normal person. I was an auditor. I spent my life searching for discrepancies, pulling at loose threads until the entire fabric of a lie unraveled. The shock lasted only a few minutes. It was quickly incinerated by a cold, absolute rage. The anger from yesterday returned, but it had changed. It was no longer chaotic. It had sharpened into a lethal, surgical focus. It felt as though a steel rod had been driven down my spine, locking my posture into rigid perfection. I picked up my silver pen. I tapped the tip exactly 3 times against the heavy paper of the ledger. Asterisk, tap, tap, tap. The sound was crisp, rhythmic, and final. Martha had made a critical structural error. She had built a brilliant, impenetrable financial fortress, but she had used my husband to construct the walls. She assumed I was exactly what I appeared to be, a quiet, compliant suburban wife who would cry over a cheating husband and blindly accept financial ruin. Something about her condescension, the kind of absolute arrogance required to eat my roasted lamb while actively orchestrating my execution, provided me with the exact leverage I needed. I looked at the digital spreadsheet. I looked at the physical ledger. I had both halves of the key. I had the origin of the funds, and I had the undeniable proof of Martha's ultimate ownership. The cartel enforcers at the bank were not looking for Robert. They were looking for the ledger. Martha had sent them, terrified that the offline backup would expose her position at the top of the pyramid. I pulled a fresh sheet of graphing paper from my desk drawer. The fear was entirely gone, replaced by the clinical detachment of a mathematician solving a complex equation. I began drawing the structural diagram of Silvercrest Equities. I mapped every offshore account, every shell company, and every routing number directly to Martha's name. Robert was a liability. He was a coward who would break the moment pressure was applied. But Martha was the target. She was the one holding the gun. I set the pen down. The lines on the paper were sharp and unforgiving. I wasn't just going to survive the weekend. I wasn't just going to survive the weekend. Emotion stopped. I wasn't going to run. I was going to systematically dismantle Silvercrest equities, and I was going to use Martha's own immaculate ledgers to bury her. Emotion, the violent, splintering crack of the heavy oak back door shattered the absolute silence of the kitchen, sending a shockwave vibrating through the soles of my bare feet. The noise was completely foreign to the insulated, quiet predictability of Oak Creek. It sounded like an explosion tearing through the drywall and ripping away the last remaining illusion of safety in my home. I froze by the sink, the glass of water slipping from my damp fingers. It hit the porcelain basin and shattered, sending sharp, crystalline shards scattering across the wet steel. I didn't breathe. The ambient hum of the refrigerator seemed to roar in my ears. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor of the mudroom, advancing steadily toward the kitchen archway. The intruder wasn't trying to be quiet. He was moving with absolute, terrifying confidence. He was moving the way a predator approaches a trapped animal. A silhouette filled the archway, blocking the dim ambient light from the hallway. He stepped forward into the harsh blue-white glare of the overhead kitchen fluorescence. It was the shorter man from the bank lobby. The jagged, pale scar running along his jawline caught the light, twisting his expression into a permanent, cruel sneer. He wore the same ill-fitting dark suit, but his right hand was now wrapped around a long, serrated tactical knife. The matte black metal absorbed the light, offering no reflection. "Where is the physical ledger, Mrs. Vance?" he asked. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, devoid of any adrenaline or urgency. It was a sterile, professional inquiry. The terror hit me with the blunt force of a physical collision. The financial puzzle I had been obsessively solving in my office upstairs vanished entirely. The cartel's brutality was no longer an abstract concept mapped out on graphing paper. It was standing in my kitchen, tracking mud across my white ceramic tiles. I backed up, pressing my spine firmly against the edge of the granite countertop. The cold stone bit through the thin fabric of my sweater. I glanced at the hallway leading to the front door. He tracked my eye movement instantly, shifting his weight to block the exit. "The ledger," he repeated, taking a slow, measured step forward. "You bring it downstairs, and this remains a quiet evening. You resist, and I start cutting." Perhaps there was a universe where I cried, where I begged for my life and surrendered the evidence. Maybe the old Elena, the compliant wife who blindly trusted Robert's financial maneuvers, would have collapsed onto the tile. But something about the absolute arrogance of his demand, the casual way he assumed I was powerless, ignited the cold, dense core of determination I had forged in the bank. I understood the equation. I was the only liability keeping Martha exposed. If I handed over the ledger, he wouldn't leave. He would eliminate the liability. "It's in the study," I lied, my voice remarkably steady despite the violent shaking in my hands. I gestured vaguely toward the ceiling. He didn't blink. He took another step forward, the tactical knife held low, angled upward. He was less than 5 feet away. The smell of stale sweat, wet asphalt, and the sharp tang of gun oil radiated from his suit. I slid my right hand backward along the smooth granite counter. My fingertips brushed against the heavy solid oak of the butcher block. I gripped the thick molded handle of the 8-inch chef's knife. The weight of the steel was a grounding, absolute reality in my palm. He lunged. It wasn't a warning strike. It was a lethal, sweeping arc aimed directly at my abdomen. I threw my weight backward, my hips slamming brutally against the corner of the kitchen island. Pain flared hot and bright across my side, but the tactical blade missed my stomach by a fraction of an inch, slicing through the empty air where I had been standing. Before he could recover his balance, I brought the heavy chef's knife down in a desperate, arcing chop. Emotion. The blade buried itself deep into the meat of his left forearm. He let out a sharp, guttural hiss of pain. The heavy boots scuffed against the tile as he staggered backward, his dark suit instantly blooming with a wet, black stain. I didn't pause to process the violence. I didn't look at the blood splattering across my pristine white cabinets. I abandoned the chef's knife, leaving it embedded in his arm, and bolted toward the dining room archway. "You dead bitch," he roared, the professional detachment completely shattered. I sprinted through the dining room, my bare feet slipping slightly on the polished hardwood. The heavy brass candelabra we had used for dinner last night sat on the edge of the table. Without breaking stride, I grabbed the base and hurled the heavy metal structure backward into the dark archway. A satisfying crash and a sharp curse confirmed it had hit its mark, buying me a crucial fraction of a second. I hit the front door at full speed, my hands frantically grappling with the deadbolt. My fingers were slick with sweat, slipping against the brass lock. I twisted it violently, yanked the handle down, and threw my body against the heavy wood. The door burst open. The cold, wet night air hit my face, carrying the smell of ozone and impending rain. I stumbled down the front steps, my bare feet hitting the rough, freezing concrete of the driveway. I didn't look back. I ran toward the dense line of oak trees separating my property from the street, plunging into the dark, wet foliage. I crouched behind the thick trunk of an ancient oak, my chest heaving with ragged, painful gasps. The rain began to fall, cold droplets stinging my face. I looked back at the house. The front door remained wide open, a rectangle of yellow light spilling onto the dark lawn. The abstract puzzle of Robert's betrayal was dead. The danger was absolute, and I was now a combatant in a war I had never asked for. I pressed my back against the rough bark of the tree, shivering violently in the cold. It felt as if the entire world had been compressed into the sharp, metallic taste of copper in my mouth, and the singular, terrifying mandate of survival. An alliance with the woman managing my husband's illicit accounts was a dangerous, volatile equation, but the alternative was a shallow grave in my own backyard. I wrapped both of my shaking hands around the thick ceramic mug, desperately trying to siphon the heat from the cheap black coffee into my freezing wet skin. The diner was completely empty, except for a tired waitress dozing behind the counter. The isolation offered a fragile, temporary illusion of safety from the storm raging outside. The flickering red neon sign of the 24-hour diner buzzed aggressively against the rain-streaked window, casting a bloody, rhythmic light across the sticky formica table. I had driven for 40 minutes, my soaking wet clothes clinging to my shivering body, before I pulled the burner phone from my pocket and dialed the only number saved in the directory. The bell above the diner door jingled. I looked up. Chloe stepped inside, violently shaking a black umbrella. She did not look like the immaculate robotic handler from the condo or the grocery store. She wore a heavy, shapeless navy wool coat over a simple gray sweatshirt. Her dark hair, usually pulled back into a severe bun, hung loose and damp around her pale face. She walked to my booth, sliding into the vinyl seat opposite me. True to her nature, she positioned herself facing the exit, her eyes immediately scanning the empty parking lot through the rain-streaked glass. "You called the emergency line," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She didn't look at me. She kept her gaze fixed on the window. "I told you to erase the drives, Mrs. Vance. I told you to play the dutiful wife. If the oversight committee tracks my location here—" "The man with the scar," I interrupted. My voice was a rasp, stripped of any polite suburban cadence. "He broke through my back door 20 minutes ago. He had a tactical knife. He missed my stomach by less than an inch." Chloe finally turned her head. Her pale green eyes locked onto mine. For the first time since I had met her, she blinked. Not just once, but in rapid, successive flutters. The crisp, businesslike facade cracked, revealing a deep, unmistakable terror underneath. She looked down at my hands. The sleeves of my ruined cashmere sweater were stained with dark, drying blood from the kitchen struggle. "He attacked you?" she asked, the professional detachment completely vanishing from her tone. "That makes no sense. The protocol mandates an assessment. You were a monitored liability. You weren't scheduled for elimination unless the quarterly audit failed." "The quarterly audit doesn't matter," I said, taking a slow, painful breath. My side throbbed viciously where I had slammed against the granite island. The physical pain was a constant, sharp reminder of my new reality. They weren't there for Robert. They were there for the physical ledgers. I secured them from the bank this afternoon. Chloe's hands dropped to the table. Her short, unpolished fingernails dug into the sticky formica. You took the offline backups. You took the master ledger. I took everything, I confirmed, leaning forward. The smell of stale grease and ozone hung between us. I took them and I decoded the routing sequences. I know where the money goes, Chloe. I know about Silvercrest equities. She recoiled slightly, her spine pressing stiffly against the red vinyl booth. It was as if I had struck her across the face. Martha Higgins is the sole proprietor, I continued, the words falling like heavy, undeniable stones onto the table. Martha is the local boss. She isn't just managing Robert. She's running the entire domestic operation. She sent the enforcer to my house tonight to tie up a loose end before the audit. Chloe stared at me. The silence stretched out, filled only by the relentless drumming of the rain against the glass and the low mechanical hum of the industrial refrigerator. I watched the realization dismantle her. The absolute confidence she had projected in the grocery store was entirely gone. "Martha," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. She brought a hand to her mouth, her fingers shaking. "She told me you were a manageable risk. She told me the enforcers were just running surveillance to ensure Robert didn't panic." I remembered the cold, dead look in Martha's eyes at the dinner table. I remembered the coated tap of her finger against the wine glass. She had manipulated Robert. She had manipulated me. And sitting across from me, I realized she had manipulated Chloe as well. "She lied to you," I said softly. Chloe dropped her hand. She looked exhausted, the dark circles under her eyes starkly visible in the harsh fluorescent lighting. The sheer vulnerability radiating from her was completely unexpected. She wasn't a criminal mastermind. She was a pragmatic survivor trapped in a machine much larger and more violent than she had anticipated. "I owe them," Chloe said, the words spilling out in a rapid, desperate cadence. "My brothers stole from a subsidiary operation in Miami 4 years ago. They gave me a choice. I balanced their books, I managed the local liabilities like Robert, and my brother gets to keep breathing. That was the equation. I follow the rules and we survive." She let out a short, hollow laugh that sounded like a sob. "But Martha doesn't follow the rules. If she's sending off-book enforcers to eliminate the wife of a regional facilitator, she isn't managing the operation. She's liquidating it. She's cleaning house, which means I'm next." The hostility I had harbored toward this woman, the resentment of the mistress, and the anger toward the cartel handler dissolved entirely. We were not enemies. We were both just numbers in Martha's ledger, entirely disposable pawns waiting to be erased. I reached across the table. I didn't grab her hand, but I rested my fingers near hers, an offering of solidarity in the face of absolute terror. "Then we balance the ledger ourselves," I said. My voice was no longer shaking. It carried the dangerous, sharpened edge of a seasoned combatant. "I have the physical ledgers. I have the digital backups. You have the access codes to the Zurich routing hubs. If Martha wants to liquidate the operation, we cut off her capital. We use the kind of leverage she can't ignore." Chloe stared at the space between our hands. The fear in her eyes was still present, heavy and paralyzing, but as she looked up at me, something else flickered in her gaze. Perhaps it was the desperate, reckless hope of a cornered animal. She didn't smile, she rarely blinked, but she reached forward, her cold fingers briefly touching mine. "We freeze the Delaware accounts," Chloe said, her voice dropping back into its crisp analytical register. "We lock her out of her own fortress." I had spent my entire career ensuring ledgers balanced perfectly. Tonight, I was going to ensure that Martha Higgins woke up with a treasury of absolute zero. The relentless rain pounded against the diner window, drowning out the frantic, rhythmic clicking of our keyboards as we dismantled a criminal empire from a sticky formica table. The twin glowing screens of our laptops illuminated the dark vinyl booth, casting a harsh blue-white light over the heavy yellowed pages of the master ledger sitting between us. The diner remained completely empty, save for the waitress who had finally fallen asleep behind the counter, her head resting on her folded arms. Chloe's fingers flew across her keyboard with terrifying speed. She didn't look at the screen. She stared directly at the physical ledger, reading the alphanumeric routing sequences and translating them into the terminal window of her encrypted operating system. The pristine robotic efficiency I had witnessed in the condo was back, but it was no longer fueled by corporate detachment. It was driven by pure, unadulterated survival instinct. The primary liquidity pool is anchored in 3 Delaware shell corporations, Chloe said. Her voice was flat, a sterile whisper cutting through the hum of the diner's industrial refrigerator. If we trigger a mass withdrawal, the automated fail-safes will lock the accounts within 60 seconds. I adjusted my glasses, pushing them up the bridge of my nose. The sharp pain in my side flared, a constant reminder of the physical brutality I had narrowly escaped less than an hour ago. But the paralyzing fear was entirely gone. It had burned away, leaving behind a cold, absolute resolve. I felt as if my blood had been replaced by ice water, sharpening my focus into a lethal weapon. "We don't trigger a mass withdrawal," I replied, my eyes scanning the spreadsheet I had built from the condo data. I tapped my silver pen exactly 3 times against the edge of the laptop casing. Asterisk, tap, tap, tap. We disguise the drain as a series of authorized interdepartmental transfers. The fail-safes are programmed to monitor outbound capital. We route the funds laterally through the secondary subsidiary accounts Robert set up last year before pushing them to the Cayman blind trusts. Chloe paused. She finally looked up from the ledger, her pale green eyes fixing on my face. She processed the logic instantly. A cascading lateral transfer. The system will register it as internal restructuring. The alarm won't trip until the final outgoing wire, and by then the capital will already be decentralized. Exactly, I said. I pushed the physical ledger toward her. "You have the administrative credentials. I have the architectural map. We execute the transfers simultaneously in batches of 5 million. Chloe didn't smile. She rarely blinked. But the tension in her jaw relaxed slightly. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, black USB drive, inserting it into the side of her laptop. The screen flashed green, confirming the decryption of the master administrative portal. Perhaps there was a time when the sheer magnitude of the money would have intimidated me. $1.2 million had been my entire life savings, a number that represented 30 years of sacrifice. But looking at the Silvercrest Equities treasury, the numbers lost their meaning. $60 million, $80 million, $120 million. It wasn't money anymore. It was ammunition. It was the only leverage keeping us alive. Martha had outsourced her violence the way a coward outsources yard work, relying entirely on the endless flow of capital to maintain her power. If we cut the financial artery, the cartel enforcers wouldn't protect her. They would turn on her. "Batch 1 is queued," Chloe announced. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple, tracking a slow line across her pale skin. Awaiting secondary authorization. I placed my fingers on the keyboard. The plastic keys were cool and smooth. I remembered the way Robert had casually poured his hazelnut coffee, dismissing my concerns. I remembered the cold, dead look in Martha's eyes at the dinner table. They had treated me like a naive, disposable variable. They had fundamentally misunderstood the kind of woman they were dealing with. "Executing batch 1, I said, pressing the enter key with a sharp, decisive strike. Emotion. The progress bar on Chloe's screen filled rapidly, shifting from yellow to solid green. "Transfer confirmed," she whispered. 5 million rerouted to the Cayman Primary Blind Trust. The domestic fail-safes did not trigger. "Cue batch 2, I commanded. For the next 45 minutes, we operated in perfect, devastating synchronization. The physical act of draining the accounts was entirely silent, a bloodless massacre executed through decimals and routing sequences. We moved 10 million, then 20, then 50. The domestic treasury of Silvercrest equities was being siphoned completely dry, drop by digital drop. My breathing was steady. The exhaustion that had threatened to crush me in the rain vanished, replaced by an empowering, intoxicating sense of vengeance. I wasn't just surviving the night. I was systematically destroying the architect of my misery. I was turning the tables on a monster who had worn the face of my best friend for 40 years. Final batch, Chloe said, her voice dropping an octave. Her hands were finally shaking, hovering over the keyboard. This empties the core holding account. The moment this clears, the quarterly audit goes critical. The system will alert Zurich immediately. I didn't hesitate. I looked at the final column on my spreadsheet. The balance was about to hit zero. Execute, I said. Chloe pressed the key. The final green bar filled the screen. She slumped back against the vinyl booth, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. The dark circles under her eyes seemed more pronounced, but the terror was gone, replaced by a profound, heavy exhaustion. I closed the physical ledger. The heavy thud of the cover echoed in the quiet diner. The equation was finally balanced. We had taken the entire cartel treasury hostage, and Martha Higgins was officially out of capital.
The jagged green waveform on Chloe's laptop pulsed violently, translating the brutal, echoing sounds of Martha's office into a terrifying digital display. The diner remained tomb silent around us, the isolation broken only by the relentless rain outside and the chilling sociopathic interrogation broadcasting from the small black speakers. Less than 10 minutes after we had drained the final holding account, Chloe had activated a hidden surveillance protocol. She had bugged Martha's primary office 6 months ago, planting a microscopic audio transmitter inside the base of a decorative desk lamp. I stared at the screen, the exhaustion completely erased by a sudden, spiking wave of pure tension. Through the static, the heavy, solid oak door of Martha's office clicked shut. "You wanted to see me, Martha." Robert's voice filtered through the speakers. He sounded perfectly relaxed, employing the smooth, charming cadence he used when he was about to lie. I could almost picture him standing there, obsessively checking his phone, adjusting his expensive silk tie. I was just wrapping up the quarterly projections for the sound of a heavy, blunt object striking bone interrupted him. It was a sickening wet thud, followed instantly by the sharp crash of shattering glass and a loud, desperate scream. The green waveform on the screen spiked into the red zone, maxing out the laptop's audio limit. I flinched, my shoulders jumping violently against the vinyl booth. Chloe didn't move. She stared blankly at the screen, her pale face illuminated by the flickering green light. "Martha, what the hell are you doing?" Robert shrieked, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. The sound of scrambling shoes echoed against a hardwood floor. He was crawling backward. "Where is the capital, Robert?" Martha asked. The voice did not belong to the woman I had known for 40 years. It was completely devoid of the exaggerated sympathy and maternal warmth she used to manipulate everyone around her. It was cold, flat, and absolute. It was the voice of an apex predator standing over a broken animal. "What capital?" Robert gasped, coughing violently. "The accounts are fine. I checked the routing logs this morning. Please, honey, I don't know what you're talking about." "Do not call me honey, you pathetic parasite," Martha snapped. The sound of heavy footsteps approached the microphone. $120 million.
The entire domestic liquidity pool, it was drained, Robert. Every single cent was transferred out of the Delaware shell corporations and pushed into impenetrable Cayman trusts 20 minutes ago. No, Robert sobbed. That's impossible. The fail-safes would trigger. The Zurich Oversight Committee would lock the system. The system didn't lock, Martha replied, her voice dropping into a deadly whisper, because the system didn't register a mass withdrawal. It registered a cascading lateral transfer. The money was moved horizontally through your secondary subsidiary accounts before it left the country. It was disguised as internal restructuring. I gripped the edge of the sticky formica table. The tension was a physical weight bearing down on my chest. I had built that exact sequence. I had used my architectural knowledge to bypass the traps Martha had set. I didn't do it, Robert begged. The sound of him weeping was pathetic, stripped of all the arrogant facade he had maintained for our entire marriage. He was a coward, finally cornered by the monster he had foolishly decided to serve. I don't even have the administrative access to execute a lateral cascade. Only Chloe has those keys. Chloe is a data entry clerk who follows orders to keep her brother breathing, Martha said coldly. She doesn't possess the structural intelligence to build a lateral cascade. This was an architectural bypass. This was executed by someone who understands exactly how to balance an impossible ledger. Silence stretched over the audio feed. The green waveform flatlined for 5 agonizing seconds. I held my breath, the taste of cold coffee and metallic adrenaline bitter on my tongue. Who else had access to your condo, Robert? Martha asked softly. No one, Robert cried. Just me and Chloe. Think carefully, Martha commanded, the threat implicit in the quiet stillness of her tone. Who else has the accounting background to read a master ledger? Who else possesses the specific, meticulous structural knowledge to dismantle a corporate failsafe? The silence returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. Elena, Robert whispered. The name sounded like a death sentence hanging in the air. Elena came to the condo yesterday, but she doesn't know anything. She thinks I'm just having an affair. She's a suburban housewife, Martha. She doesn't understand. She is a senior auditor, you imbecile. Martha roared. The sudden explosive volume made the laptop speakers crackle. The master manipulator had finally lost control. The realization that she had been outplayed, not by a rival cartel boss or a federal agency, but by the quiet, compliant woman she had patronized for decades, shattered her composure. She sat at my dinner table, Martha seized, her breath ragged and audible over the microphone. She drank my wine, and she already knew. She played you perfectly, Robert. She used your own sloppy, arrogant security protocols to steal the entire treasury. I'll fix it, Robert pleaded frantically. I'll find her. I'll make her reverse the transfers. You won't do anything, Martha said, her voice regaining its terrifying, icy edge. You are a liability, and I am liquidating my liabilities. 2 sharp, deafening gunshots erupted through the audio feed. The concussive blasts overloaded the microphone, reducing the sound to a harsh digital screech before cutting out entirely into dead air. I stared at the flat line on the screen. The reality of what had just happened slammed into me. Robert was dead. The man I had loved, the man who had betrayed me, had just been executed on a live audio feed. But there was no time for grief. The tension in the diner escalated into absolute, terrifying clarity. Martha knew. The illusion was over. It felt as though the crosshairs of a sniper rifle had just settled directly between my shoulder blades. Chloe slowly reached forward and closed the laptop. The sharp click of the plastic hinge sounded like a gunshot in the quiet diner. She knows, Chloe whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Saltine pennefice. The wetter way in a full ink 4 plus plate store. She's going to send everyone she has. We need to run.
I snatched the cheap hard plastic phone from the sticky formica table, my thumb hovering over the smooth red disconnect button as the agonizing sound of Robert weeping filled my ear. The sharp synthetic ringing had sliced through the quiet diner, vibrating violently against the table just as Chloe and I were packing our laptops into the dark shadows of her bag. The digital triumph of draining the Silver Crest treasury, the empowering, intoxicating sense of vengeance I had felt just moments ago, evaporated instantly. He is bleeding quite heavily on my imported rug, Elena, Martha said. Her voice was not the cold, flat bark of the apex predator I had heard over the audio feed. It had reverted completely to the warm, exaggerated sympathy she used to manipulate the world. It was the exact same sweet tone she had used to comfort me when my mother died. The exact same cadence she employed while drinking my wine at the dinner table. "Martha," I whispered, my voice tight. The rigid plastic casing of the phone dug a sharp pain into my damp palm. The smell of stale coffee and wet wool hung heavy in the cold, damp air of the diner. "The gunshots were loud, weren't they?" Martha continued smoothly. The ambient background noise of her office echoed faintly behind her voice. "The first bullet shattered his right kneecap. The second went through his left femur. He's in a tremendous amount of physical pain, sweetie. You really should hear it." The audio shifted. The rough rustle of a phone being handed over was followed immediately by a ragged, wet scream. "Elena!" Robert shrieked. His voice was completely unrecognizable, stripped of all the charming, arrogant polish he had weaponized for 40 years. It was the raw, animalistic sound of pure agony. "Elena, please, give it back. Give her the money. She's going to kill me." I closed my eyes, pressing my spine firmly against the stiff, cold vinyl of the booth. I tasted the bitter, metallic ash of betrayal on my dry tongue. I remembered the smooth way he had dismissed my concerns about the offshore accounts. Emotion.
I remembered the heavy weight of the tactical knife the enforcer had swung at me in my own kitchen. He was a pathetic hollow man who had gambled our entire existence for a 20% return. "He betrayed you, Elena," Chloe whispered from across the table. Her pale green eyes were wide, fixed on the glowing screen of the burner phone. She rarely blinked, but her hands were trembling violently as she zipped the thick fabric of her laptop bag. "He brought the enforcer to your house. He's a liability." She was right. The logical, analytical part of my brain, the auditor, knew exactly how this equation balanced. Robert was the weak link. Letting Martha finish the job would sever the last remaining tie I had to this nightmare, but the terror I had felt in the house did not return. It was incinerated by a white-hot, absolute fury that felt like boiling water in my veins. It wasn't just fury at Robert for his weakness. It was a localized, devastating rage directed entirely at Martha. For 40 years, she had worn the face of my best friend. The sheer arrogance of her manipulation, the casual brutality with which she assumed I would simply surrender, felt as if a heavy steel rod had been driven straight down my spine. Martha's sweet voice returned to the line. "He has maybe 45 minutes before the arterial blood loss becomes fatal, Elena. I know you moved the capital into a Cayman blind trust. I know you used the lateral cascading protocols. It was a brilliant move. I severely underestimated you. But brilliance does not stop bullets." "What do you want?" I asked. My voice did not shake. It carried a dangerous, sharp edge that surprised even me. "I want the administrative decryption keys to the Cayman trusts," Martha stated, the maternal warmth dropping slightly to reveal the cold, hard, sociopathic core beneath. Emotion.
"Bring them to the private shipping warehouse off Route 9. You have exactly 1 hour. If you do not arrive, or if you contact the authorities, I will shoot Robert in the head, and then I will send the rest of my enforcers to hunt you down. You cannot hide $120 million forever, Elena. I will find you." The line went dead with a sharp, loud electronic click. I lowered the dark phone. The diner's flickering overhead fluorescence cast long, unnatural blue-white shadows over the empty white coffee cups on the table. Outside, the relentless heavy drops of rain continued to crash loudly against the glass window, a chaotic rhythm matching the violent pounding of my heart. I had to make a decision. I held the keys to the entire cartel treasury. I had the leverage. If I walked away, Robert died, and Chloe and I would spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, smelling the phantom scent of gunpowder in the dark. "You aren't actually going to give her the money?" Chloe asked, her voice cracking. She stood up, pulling her heavy dark wool coat tight against her body. "She won't let you leave that warehouse alive, Mrs. Vance. It's a trap." I looked at Chloe's pale, exhausted face. She was a survivor, a pragmatist who understood the brutal reality of the cartel, but she didn't understand the depth of the betrayal. "No," I said, standing up from the booth. I grabbed my oversized tote bag, the heavy weight of the physical ledger thumping reassuringly against my hip. "We aren't going to disappear, and I am not giving her the money." "Then what are you doing?" Chloe demanded, genuine panic flooding her features. "I am going to the warehouse," I replied, walking toward the diner's exit. The fury was cold and solid within me, a protective armor against the terror. Martha thinks she controls the variables because she holds the gun.
Tense, but she is operating on incomplete data. I am going to balance the books on my own terms. Pansy, walking unarmed toward a cartel boss holding a loaded gun, should have been paralyzing, but the trap I had already set in motion provided an unbreakable armor of absolute courage. I stepped out of the heavy, dark rain and into the cavernous, abandoned shipping warehouse. The cold, damp air instantly bit through my thin, soaked sweater. The smell of old motor oil, stale dust, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood hung heavily in the dim space. The heavy, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the corrugated tin roof echoed loudly through the massive structure. It failed entirely to drown out the wet, ragged, pathetic sound of Robert struggling to breathe. I walked slowly toward the center of the warehouse. My wet rubber soles squeaked softly against the rough, cold gray concrete. A single bright white halogen work light hung from a heavy steel beam, illuminating a small, stark circle in the center of the vast, pitch-black room. The swinging bulb cast long, violently shifting black shadows against the rust-stained walls. Martha stood directly under the harsh glare of the halogen lamp. She wore a pristine, tailored white trench coat that looked completely absurd in the dirty industrial setting. Two large men in dark wetsuits stood motionless in the deep shadows just beyond the ring of light. Their hands rested firmly on the smooth black grips of the pistols holstered at their waists. At Martha's feet, Robert was lying in a rapidly expanding pool of thick, dark red blood. Both of his pant legs were shredded and soaked, the dark fabric clinging to the ruined flesh of his knees. He looked up as I approached, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. He raised a shaking hand, his fingers weakly grasping at the expensive silk tie still knotted around his neck. "Elena," he wheezed, his voice a broken, wet rasp. "Elena, please, give it to her." I stopped exactly 10 feet away from Martha. I didn't look at Robert. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the woman who had been my best friend for 40 years. I tasted the cold rain and the bitter, sharp ash of adrenaline on my lips, but my hands, resting empty at my sides, were perfectly still. "You look completely exhausted, sweetie," Martha said, taking a slow step forward. The casual, suffocating warmth in her voice was staggering. It was the exact same bright, sympathetic tone she used at garden parties and charity dinners. She reached her hand out, gesturing toward me with manicured, perfectly painted red fingernails, feigning an intimacy that made my stomach churn. Her eyes, however, remained flat, dead, and entirely devoid of human empathy. She held a heavy silver semi-automatic pistol in her left hand, the smooth metal gleaming brightly under the harsh light. "I brought you a towel from the car," Martha continued smoothly, as if we were standing in my kitchen rather than an execution chamber. "You must be freezing. Just hand over the black USB drive with the Cayman decryption keys, and we can get Robert into a warm ambulance." The manipulation was flawless. Perhaps the old Elena, the compliant, quiet woman who baked casseroles and trusted her husband, would have broken down weeping at the sight of the blood. Maybe she would have handed over the keys to save a man who had repeatedly betrayed her, but something about the sheer sociopathic audacity of Martha's performance, the way a monster could so easily wear a familiar, comforting mask, solidified the cold steel in my spine. I understood the reality of the room. Robert was already dead. The ambulance was a lie designed to exploit a weakness I no longer possessed. "I didn't bring the drive, Martha," I said. My voice echoed loudly off the tin roof, calm, sharp, and completely devoid of fear. Martha stopped moving. The sympathetic smile froze on her face, hardening into a tight, thin line. The maternal mask slipped, revealing the terrifying, calculating predator beneath. "Don't be stupid, Elena," Martha snapped, her voice dropping into the harsh, gravelly register I had heard over the audio feed. I have two men pointing hollow point rounds at your spine. I have your husband bleeding out on the floor. Amosin, you do not have the luxury of playing games. Give me the keys. You don't understand the equation, I replied, holding my ground. I didn't flinch. I didn't look at the men in the dark shadows. You think you control the variables because you hold a silver gun. But violence is only a tool. Capital is the foundation, and you are entirely bankrupt. Martha raised the heavy pistol, pointing the dark, hollow barrel directly at the center of my chest. The sharp, mechanical click of the safety being disengaged echoed loudly in the quiet space. I will shoot him in the head, Martha threatened, her pale eyes narrowing into vicious slits. And then I will blow your kneecaps off and let my men take the drive from your corpse. I am losing my patience. Shoot him, I said coldly. Robert let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail, his head dropping heavily against the wet, cold concrete. Martha stared at me, genuine confusion flashing across her face for the first time. She had calculated my behavior based on decades of quiet submission. She had expected me to fold under the weight of the terror. She had not prepared for an auditor who had already balanced the ledger. You're bluffing, Martha hissed, stepping closer. The smell of her expensive, sweet floral perfume clashed violently with the metallic stench of the blood. You don't have the stomach to watch him die. He died the moment he handed my life to a cartel, I said, my voice steady and unforgiving. The courage radiating through my chest was absolute. I was standing face to face with the monster, and I was not afraid. I didn't come here to negotiate for his life. Emotion, I didn't come here to give you the money. I came here to watch you realize that your entire empire is gone. The two enforcers stepped simultaneously out of the dark shadows, their heavy black boots scuffing the rough gray floor as they raised their matte black weapons. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, circling the bright pool of harsh white halogen light. Martha held her ground in the center of the warehouse, the heavy silver pistol pointed directly at my chest. The sharp, mechanical click of her pulling back the hammer echoed loudly against the cold concrete walls, momentarily drowning out the heavy drumming of the rain on the tin roof. The smell of her sweet floral perfume mixed violently with the sharp metallic stench of Robert's fresh blood, creating a suffocating odor in the dim industrial space. You are out of your mind, Martha said, her voice a harsh, gravelly whisper. She tightened her grip on the smooth metal handle of the gun. The charming maternal mask was entirely gone, replaced by the bare, ugly face of a cornered predator. I will put a hollow point bullet through your lung right now. You think you've balanced the books? You're a dead woman standing in a cold room? I didn't flinch. The heavy weight of the confrontation pressed against me, but I felt no fear. I felt the cold, hard certainty of an auditor who had already submitted the final report. I spent 20 hours cross-referencing your domestic ledgers with the condo data, I said. My voice was calm, projecting clearly across the empty space. I kept my hands visible, resting loosely against my wet sweater. I traced the lateral transfers. I tracked the shell companies. But the numbers didn't balance, Martha. The liquidity pool in Delaware was consistently light. You were shorting the Zurich returns by exactly 4.2% every quarter. Martha's pale eyes widened fractionally. The silver gun wavered for a microsecond. You've been skimming from the cartel for 5 years, I continued, driving the words forward like heavy steel spikes. You used Robert's arrogant, sloppy transfers to hide the deficit. You let him steal $1 million from our retirement fund to pad the accounts before the quarterly audits, so the Zurich Oversight Committee wouldn't notice the massive hole you were digging in their treasury. Robert groaned weakly from the floor, his head rolling against the wet concrete. He was barely conscious, a pathetic variable that had already been zeroed out of the equation. Shut up, Martha hissed.
She took a step toward me, closing the distance to 6 feet. The bright overhead light cast long, dark shadows over her tailored white coat. It doesn't matter what you think you found. I have the men. I have the gun. If you don't give me the decryption keys to the Cayman trusts right now, I am going to paint this floor with your brains. I looked past Martha, focusing on the two silent enforcers standing in the dim shadows just behind her. I didn't hide the money in a Cayman blind trust, Martha, I said slowly, emphasizing every sharp syllable. I told Chloe to route it horizontally to bypass your domestic fail-safes, but the final destination wasn't an offshore account I controlled. I sent the entire $120 million directly back to the primary Zurich holding accounts. Martha froze, the color drained completely from her face, leaving her skin a stark, ghostly white under the halogen bulb. Perhaps there was a moment where she thought I was bluffing. Maybe the sheer audacity of the move, the kind of absolute suicidal risk a compliant suburban housewife would never take, briefly overloaded her sociopathic confidence. You sent it back to the cartel, she whispered, the words barely audible over the drumming rain. I sent the capital back, I corrected her, tapping my index finger against my thumb exactly 3 times. Asterisk, tap, tap, tap. And I attached the decoded physical ledger as an encrypted metadata file on the wire transfer. I gave the Zurich Oversight Committee the exact routing numbers of your personal skimming accounts. I balanced their books for them. The realization hit her with the physical force of a freight train. The empire she had built on manipulation and betrayal crumbled in an instant. She wasn't holding a hostage anymore. She was holding a smoking gun in the middle of a massive, undeniable theft. Before Martha could open her mouth to speak, a sharp electronic chime pierced the silence of the warehouse. The sound didn't come from my pocket. It came from the dark shadows behind Martha. The taller enforcer reached into his dark suit jacket and pulled out a small burner phone.
The bright blue light of the screen illuminated his jagged jawline. He read the text message. He didn't say a word. He simply raised his right hand and tapped his earpiece twice. The shorter enforcer mirrored the movement perfectly. In perfect synchronization, both men lowered their matte black weapons, shifting their aim away from me. They raised the heavy barrels, pointing them directly at the back of Martha's head. Martha didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She understood the brutal mechanics of the cartel better than anyone. The moment the Zurich committee verified the ledger, she ceased being a regional boss. She became a liability. Her hand began to shake violently. The heavy silver pistol drooped, the barrel pointing toward the bloody concrete floor. "Elena," Martha gasped, the warm maternal tone suddenly returning to her voice in a desperate, pathetic rush. It felt as though I was watching a snake try to shed its skin in reverse. "Elena, sweetie, please. We've been friends for 40 years. I can fix this. Just tell them you fabricated the ledger. I'll give you everything." I looked at the woman who had eaten dinner at my table, who had held my hand, who had systematically destroyed my life with a smile on her face. The fury was gone, replaced by a cold, absolute emptiness. "The books are already balanced, Martha," I said softly. I turned my back on her. I didn't wait for the enforcers to speak. I walked slowly out of the bright halogen circle and into the dark, echoing shadows of the warehouse. My wet shoes squeaked softly on the concrete. Emotion.
I reached the heavy metal exit door, pushed the cold crash bar, and stepped out into the freezing, relentless rain. The heavy thud of a body hitting the concrete floor echoed from inside the warehouse, followed by absolute silence.
A quick execution by the cartel was a professional courtesy Martha did not deserve. I wanted her to spend the rest of her life in a cold, sterile cage. The deafening wail of police sirens completely drowned out the steady, rhythmic drumming of the cold storm, signaling the violent, absolute end of a 40-year deception. I sat perfectly still in the driver's seat of my sedan, parked roughly 200 yards from the loading docks. The heater was running full blast, blowing dry, hot air against my wet skin, but I kept the driver's side window rolled down an inch. I wanted to hear the collapse, the blinding, chaotic flash of bright red and blue strobe lights sliced violently through the heavy, dark rain. They reflected off the wet black asphalt and illuminated the rusted steel walls of the abandoned warehouse. Dozens of heavy, armored tactical vehicles screeched to a halt in the muddy lot, their thick tires spraying curtains of dirty water into the dark air. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Drop the weapons. A loud, electronically amplified voice boomed from the lead vehicle, the sharp sound echoing aggressively against the corrugated tin roof. Heavily armed tactical agents poured out of the black vans like a swarm of angry hornets. The harsh white beams of their mounted flashlights cut through the rain, casting long, erratic white streaks across the industrial landscape. The loud, heavy thud of heavy combat boots hitting the wet concrete formed a terrifying, synchronized rhythm. I rested my hands on the smooth, warm leather of the steering wheel. The metallic taste of cold adrenaline was finally fading from my tongue, replaced by the clean, sweet taste of fresh rain drifting through the cracked window. I hadn't just returned the stolen money to the cartel holding accounts. 3 hours ago, before I ever walked into the diner to meet Chloe, I had compiled a duplicate set of the decrypted ledgers. I had walked into a 24-hour post office and mailed the physical flash drives, along with a meticulously highlighted hard copy of Martha's routing structure, directly to the local field office of the FBI. Emotion. I had called their anonymous tip line from a separate burner phone, providing the exact location of the warehouse and warning them of an active cartel execution. The trap I had built for Martha was a dual-layered cage. The cartel stripped her of her power and her empire, rendering her entirely defenseless. The federal agents ensured she would survive just long enough to face total, public humiliation. Through the rain-streaked glass of my windshield, I watched the heavy metal exit doors of the warehouse swing violently open. 2 tactical agents dragged the enforcers out first. The men in the dark suits were thrown face down onto the rough, wet gravel, their hands pinned brutally behind their backs. The dull silver glint of heavy steel handcuffs flashed in the strobe lights. Then they brought Martha out. She looked entirely pathetic. Her pristine white tailored coat was smeared with dark gray dirt and thick red blood. The confident sociopathic manipulator who had held a gun to my chest was completely gone. She stumbled on the wet concrete, her manicured hands bound tightly behind her back. The harsh red and blue lights illuminated her pale, terrified face. Her wet blonde hair was plastered against her skull. She looked like a cornered rat pulled from a flooded sewer. Behind her, a team of paramedics rushed a rolling stretcher out of the warehouse. Robert was strapped to the flat plastic board, an oxygen mask covering his mouth. Thick white bandages were wrapped tightly around his shattered legs, rapidly soaking through with dark crimson stains. He was alive, but the charming, arrogant facade he had weaponized for 40 years was permanently destroyed. He would recover just in time to spend the final decades of his life rotting in a federal penitentiary. I leaned back against the soft, dry fabric of my car seat. The heavy weight of the past 2 days, the terror, the running, the desperate, frantic calculations lifted entirely from my chest. I breathed in the smell of the damp pine trees and the sharp scent of the car's air freshener. The world felt incredibly quiet inside the cabin, despite the chaotic symphony of sirens and shouting raging outside. I understood the sheer magnitude of what I had accomplished. I had walked into the jaws of a violent criminal machine armed with nothing but a spreadsheet and a silver pen, and I had systematically dismantled the entire structure. Perhaps Martha and Robert thought my quiet, compliant nature was a symptom of weakness. Maybe they truly believed a suburban wife lacked the capacity for ruthlessness, but they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my profession. An auditor does not rely on violence. An auditor relies on absolute terrifying precision. The ledger was finally perfectly balanced. The debts were paid in full. I reached down and shifted the transmission into drive. I didn't spare a final glance at the flashing lights or the wreckage of the people who had betrayed me. I pressed my foot smoothly against the accelerator. The tires hummed quietly against the wet asphalt as I pulled out of the dark gravel lot. I drove into the cold, heavy rain, leaving the ruins of my old life burning in the rearview mirror. Emotion? Looking at the haggard, ruined man sitting in the heavy silver wheelchair, I realized the terrifying monster who had destroyed my life was nothing more than a hollow, cowardly parasite. The heavy, solid steel door slammed shut behind me with a deafening metallic crash, sealing us inside the sterile, windowless visitation room of the federal penitentiary. The sharp industrial smell of strong bleach and stale floor wax hung heavily in the freezing air, amplifying the harsh, blinding glare of the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. I walked slowly to the small metal table bolted to the gray concrete floor and sat down on the hard plastic chair. Robert was wheeled in a moment later by a large, silent guard. The transformation was absolute. The charming, arrogant investment banker who had worn expensive silk ties and drank fine scotch was completely gone. He was dressed in a stiff, bright orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his dramatically thinned frame. Heavy silver chains connected his wrists to his waist. His face was pale and deeply lined, his jaw covered in patches of gray stubble. The thick white bandages wrapping his shattered legs were visible beneath the short hem of the orange fabric. "You actually came, Elena," Robert wheezed, attempting to summon a weak, pathetic smile. The sound of his voice echoed thinly against the cold concrete walls. He reached his chained hands forward, instinctively moving to touch the collar of his shirt, as if reaching for a tie that no longer existed. I didn't think you would answer the request. I didn't smile. I didn't reach out to touch him. I placed a thick, heavy manila envelope on the smooth surface of the cold metal table. "I came to deliver these," I said, my voice perfectly clear and devoid of any emotional tremor. I slid the stiff brown paper across the cold steel until it stopped inches from his trembling fingers. "The divorce papers are fully processed. The federal prosecutors have already signed off on the asset separation." Robert stared at the thick white stack of papers spilling slightly from the envelope. His pale hands shook violently, the heavy metal chains clinking loudly against the edge of the table. "Elena, please," he begged, the charming facade cracking instantly. "You can't do this right now. The feds seized everything. The condo is gone." Martha's accounts are frozen. The cartel lawyers are trying to pin the entire Delaware embezzlement scheme on me. I have absolutely nothing left. I sat perfectly still. I adjusted my glasses, pushing the smooth plastic frames up the bridge of my nose. The terrifying, paralyzing fear I had lived with for decades, the fear of upsetting him, the fear of losing the comfortable life I thought we had built, was completely eradicated. It was replaced by the clean, solid weight of absolute justice. "You gambled our entire existence for a 20% return on a cartel laundering scheme, Robert," I replied, keeping my tone as flat and precise as a balance sheet. "You handed the keys to our home to an enforcer with a tactical knife. You are facing 30 years in a federal cage because you were a coward who thought he could outsmart a monster. But you stole the money," Robert cried out, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate shriek. He leaned forward, the squeak of the wheelchair tires cutting through the silent room. "You and Chloe drained the entire treasury. You sent the ledger to Zurich, but the FBI said the full amount wasn't recovered. You kept it. You have millions of dollars, Elena." You have to help me pay for a defense attorney. I pulled my silver pen from my dark coat pocket. I held it lightly between my index finger and my thumb. The FBI recovered exactly $118.8 million from the Zurich accounts, I stated, reading the numbers with sharp, cold precision. That represents the cartel's operating capital, minus the specific deficit Martha had skimmed over the past 5 years. Robert stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "What about the rest?" he whispered, his breathing shallow and rapid. "What about the other 1.2 million?" I looked directly into his pathetic, terrified eyes. $1.2 million was the exact amount of our joint retirement fund, I said softly. The money I earned over 30 years of meticulous, exhausting corporate auditing. The money you stole from me to pad Martha's accounts before the quarterly inspection. I tapped the silver pen exactly 3 times against the hard metal table. Asterisk tap, tap, tap. I didn't steal cartel money, Robert, I continued, the deep satisfaction of the moment settling warmly into my chest. I legally reclaimed my original principal investment. Emotion? Before I sent the primary funds to Zurich, I routed exactly $1.2 million through an airtight, heavily encrypted offshore corporate structure that I designed myself. It is entirely untraceable. The FBI considers it an acceptable loss in taking down a regional cartel boss. The cartel considers it the cost of identifying a thief within their ranks. Robert's jaw dropped. The realization that he had been completely, utterly outplayed by the woman he had patronized for 40 years hit him with devastating force. He slumped back against the cheap vinyl seat of the wheelchair, the metal frame groaning under his weight. "You took a 20% return, Robert," I said, standing up from the cold plastic chair. "I took 100% of my life back." I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned my back on the ruined, empty man sitting at the table. I pressed the red buzzer on the wall. The heavy steel door clicked loudly and swung open. I walked out of the freezing visitation room, down the long, brightly lit concrete corridor, and passed through the final heavy security gate. The guard stamped my paperwork and pushed open the thick glass exit doors. I stepped outside. The violent rainstorm that had washed over the city for 3 days had finally broken. The air smelled incredibly clean, carrying the sharp, sweet scent of wet pine needles and fresh ozone. The bright, warm sunlight hit my face, melting away the final lingering traces of the cold terror I had carried for weeks. The equation was closed. The ledger was perfectly balanced. I walked toward my car, leaving the heavy gray walls of the prison behind me. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed loudly behind me on the concrete. I stopped immediately. A loud, sharp voice shattered the silence. I stared back at the dark shadow of the heavy steel door, wondering who had followed me and what they wanted. I waited, holding my breath, until I realized it was just a guard yelling to a coworker. Before the terror could return, I remembered that Martha's gun and the pooling blood on the warehouse floor were finally in the past. I didn't wait to see where the guard was going. I quickly opened my car door, locked it, and drove away, truly free. Emotion. The sharp, bright pop of the heavy cork echoed softly over the low, steady hum of the twin-jet engines, followed immediately by the cold fizz of golden champagne pouring into heavy crystal flutes. I leaned back against the plush, warm white leather of the wide first-class seat. Through the small, thick oval window to my right, the bright, blinding sunlight reflected off the massive silver wing of the aircraft. Below us, the endless, deep turquoise expanse of the Caribbean Sea stretched all the way to the curved horizon. The sky was a brilliant, flawless blue, completely devoid of the dark, heavy storm clouds that had suffocated me back in the city. "Thank you, sir," Chloe said. Her voice was clear and light, completely stripped of the crisp, paranoid tension that had defined her for months. I turned my head to look at her. The transformation was remarkable. The heavy, dark wool coats and the pale, exhausted complexion were gone. She wore a light, brightly colored silk blouse, and the dark, heavy circles under her eyes had completely faded. She looked like a woman who had finally woken up from a long, terrifying nightmare. The flight attendant, dressed in a sharp navy blue vest, handed us each a cold crystal flute. The smooth, chilled glass felt grounding against my palm. The sweet, crisp scent of the expensive vintage mixed pleasantly with the clean, highly filtered air of the pressurized cabin. I remembered the metallic smell of blood in the warehouse, and it felt as though that memory belonged to an entirely different person. I still check the exits every time we walk into a new room, Chloe admitted, tracing the rim of her glass with her index finger. A genuine, relaxed smile finally broke across her face. I suppose the paranoia doesn't wash off overnight. It shouldn't, I replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of the cold, sweet liquid. The bubbles popped sharply against my tongue. Paranoia is just another form of risk assessment. It keeps the ledger balanced. But the risk profile has fundamentally changed, Chloe. The variables that threatened us no longer exist in the equation. I understood now that we are entirely safe. She nodded, looking out the window at the bright blue sky. Something about the way the light hit her face made her look 10 years younger. We were 4 weeks removed from the violent climax in the abandoned shipping warehouse. The news cycle back home had been dominated by the massive federal takedown of a regional money laundering syndicate. Martha Higgins was currently sitting in a sterile concrete holding cell without bail, facing a laundry list of federal racketeering charges and a cartel bounty on her head. Robert was recovering from his shattered legs under heavy federal guard, completely bankrupt and utterly alone. The empire Martha had built on manipulation and brutal violence had crumbled into ash. The people who had betrayed me, who had assumed my quiet nature was a symptom of pathetic weakness, were locked in heavy steel cages. Meanwhile, the $1.2 million I had carefully extracted from the domestic accounts had multiplied significantly. Before we boarded the flight, I had finalized the transfer of our new untraceable assets into a series of highly secure, perfectly legal international holding trusts. I had used my architectural knowledge to build a financial fortress that neither the FBI nor the cartel could ever locate. We were not just survivors. We were wealthy, independent women operating entirely on our own terms, embracing the kind of absolute freedom that only comes from perfect leverage. Do you think he ever understood? Chloe asked softly, taking a slow sip of her champagne. She didn't specify who she was talking about, but I knew. Do you think Robert realized what you actually did? I rested my flute on the small, polished wood tray table in front of me. I pulled a new expensive silver pen from my designer handbag. It was a heavy, perfectly balanced writing instrument. I also pulled out a small, blank leather notebook. The crisp white pages were completely empty, representing a flawless, clean slate. Maybe Robert only understood the superficial elements of any transaction, I said, my voice carrying a profound, quiet peace. He understood the charm, the expensive suits, and the illusion of power. Emotion. Perhaps he never understood the math. He never realized that the person quietly balancing the books is the only person who truly controls the entire system. It felt as if he was playing a completely different game. I tapped the heavy silver pen exactly 3 times against the hard leather cover of the notebook. Asterisk, tap, 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 tap. He understands it now, I added. The way a defeated gambler finally sees the house advantage. Chloe let out a soft, melodic laugh. The sound was incredibly pure, completely free of the cynical edge I had heard in the dark diner. She raised her crystal flute, holding it up toward the bright sunlight streaming through the cabin window. To clean slates, Mrs. Vance, Chloe said warmly. To balancing the books, Chloe, I replied, raising my glass to meet hers. The sharp, bright clink of the heavy crystal echoed softly over the hum of the engines. I took another sip of the cold champagne, savoring the crisp, sweet taste of absolute freedom. I looked down at the blank white page of my new notebook. There were no deficits to hide. There were no violent threats to mitigate. The terrifying monster who had worn the face of my best friend was gone, and the pathetic man who had broken his vows was locked away. I closed the notebook and set my pen down. I leaned my head back against the soft white leather seat and closed my eyes, letting the warm sunlight wash over my face. The profound, heavy weight of the past 40 years was completely gone. I was a survivor. I was in absolute control of my own destiny. And for the first time in my life, I was truly completely at peace. Emotion,